I look, like I said, I'm sharing what's convincing to me.
I understand.
When I see a parallel literary structure that is conspicuous, that it's quite obvious that this is not just happenstance. This is the author putting things together, setting things next to each other in a way so you can see them in parallel, and that you have these themes. That's exegesis. That's considering authorial intent. How is he putting his writings together? What point are we to conclude by the way he structured his writings? That's exegesis. Exegesis is also to consider the customs, habits, religion, culture, political, religious context of the audience of that scripture and draw conclusions from within that framework. And for example, not opposing like American ideals on the scene, or not imposing something else. So like I said, it might not be convincing to you, but to myself and to many Adventists, that is extremely convincing. As exegetical, literary context, historical context. And that's what all I'm saying is and quite frankly, I love you, brother, but it matters not to me whether you think it's exegetical or not. I love you, but what it is, it does show a clear exegesis of Daniel's book. And out of that clear exegesis of Daniel's book, a very strong thematic parallel to the Day of Atonement, which is both a rectification of the sanctuary and an examination of the people of God. So, like I said, convincing to me, even if not to you.
And I appreciate you admitting that that's convincing to you. It's not convincing to me, and it's also not convincing to half the scholars in this church and a large percentage of scholars in Adventism way back in the day who have wrote papers and can come to conclusions that they absolutely could not exegete from the Hebrew text to come to that conclusion, a connection or a correlation between Leviticus 16. Because let's be honest, you could say that, that there is you recognize that there's no linguistic, and the linguistics here doesn't really matter to you, because at the end of the day, you've had other ways, like you just explained.
Respectfully, I didn't say it didn't matter. I said it's not the strongest link.
Okay, well,
for example,
so you spoke a lot earlier. I'm going to speak now, if you don't mind. I appreciate
Go ahead, brother. But representing fairly, I never said it didn't matter to me. I said it's not our strongest link.
You didn't say it didn't matter, but you clearly came across as if the linguistics is not the deciding factor for you, which is fine.
It's not. I'll agree with that.
But I would say that but if you're using proper exegesis, and you're going to, in the larger scope of things, because let's be honest, when we start getting into what Adventism believes about this judgment, it's very much parallel to the Day of Atonement. That anti-type connection is there. And so when you start digging
I just admitted that fully.
Yeah. And so in this sense, I think that you have to be able to bring in, especially when you're using the word cleansing. Like you said, you built a case. There's clear evidence to suggest that the word for cleansing there don't even belong as a translation. That King James actually got that wrong, because it's more influenced by the Septuagint than the original Hebrew text. Because that means to vindicate, to restore, not to cleanse.
And I admitted that too. Of connecting the idea of rectification and cleansing, there's a very strong link. And so you can't just out and out dismiss that there's a strong conceptual link between Nitztak and Taher, even if it's not strictly the same word.
But I'm getting down, because I appreciate your attempt at scholarship here, and I'm not denying that what you're saying you're convinced on, and that is the reasons for why you've come to that conclusion. I'm looking at the teaching of Seventh-day Adventism, the Daniel 8 chapter 8 verse 14. Interpretively, when they interpret that text, they believe that applying the day-year principle there, which that's, again, I've said that earlier, I don't see how in the world you even have precedents or a foundation even apply that there. But
the issue with which I wrestled, not any longer, was when you look at Daniel 8:14 and somehow or another believe that these are 2,300 prophetic years as opposed to days, and some would contend they're 1,150 days. I mean, we don't have to get into all that. There is no basis that there is a day for a year. There's no basis for that. I understand Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6, but when you look at that, that was specific to the 12 men that went into the land of Canaan, 10 brought an unfavorable report, 2 brought a favorable report. And because of their disobedience, he said, you were gone for 40 days, and now you will wander the wilderness for 40 years.
Well,
It's not prophetic.
I did watch your video where you got into that, and you did actually see the connection between the 70-year prophecy and the 2300. At least that's what I had gotten from your video. And I think that establishes the connection, because Gabriel appears to Daniel in chapter 8 in verse number 16, 17. His purpose was to help Daniel understand that vision.
Right. To understand the difference between the chazon and the moray.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is that vision, you have the Hazon and the Moray, but they're both referring to that vision as a whole.
Oh, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree with that at all.
In general terms, that vision does start with the ram, which represents Medo-Persia, and then in verse 26, it's called the vision of the evenings and mornings.
Right.
And so Gabriel was to help him understand that, and he didn't understand it by the end of the chapter.
Nope. So took him the next chapter.
Yeah, and so in the next chapter, that's when we see Gabriel, who says, who appeared to me in the vision, and 21 to 23. So it's clearly the vision of chapter 8. And so he gives him that prophecy of the 70 weeks to help him understand the 2300. So that shows, well, if the 70 weeks, those are years, that also shows that the context is these 2300 must also be years. Also, because we're talking about the rise and fall of nations, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. So it's not going to be a literal. So I think would establish the connection.
And I can see that. I can appreciate that viewpoint. I would submit to you that what we see in the 2300, and I haven't made up my mind completely of what that all entails, to be totally honest with you.
You don't have a conclusion on what that is?
I lean towards more of the thought process that it dealt with Antiochus Epiphanes, but I'm not going to definitively say that's what it is.
They apply that day-year principle to arrive at 1844 to say that there's the judgment based on investigation, an investigative judgment that began in 1844 based on a Leviticus 16 correlation. And so
the key passage, Daniel 8:14, which refers to the sanctuary, 2300 evenings, mornings, or 2300 days, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. The sanctuary would be justified. Some translations say justified or cleansed or made righteous or made right with God. Right. Now, when you look at Job 25:4, Job 15:14, and also Proverbs 20 verse 9, we see that that word justification, the word used in Daniel 8:14 is parallel to being made pure, and is also parallel to being cleansed. So being cleansed, being made pure, being justified, all these concepts are basically paralleling one another, and that. And the word for the cleansing used in Leviticus 16:19, that's the word that is paralleled to being made pure, being justified. And so we're dealing with ultimately a spiritual cleansing. We're not dealing with the high priest going into the most holy place with Windex and a sponge and washing things off. But ultimately, this is a spiritual cleansing, a spiritual justification.
Go for it.
Roy Gain is a Hebrew scholar who wrote this. And so he does point out that connection that I was talking about earlier in
Leviticus 16:19. Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, with the Job 25:4, Job 15:14, and I also had seen the connection with Proverbs 20 verse 9, where you see this parallel between these words for cleansing, being purified, being justified. Right. And I think also what the context is of Daniel chapter 8 is the sanctuary context, not just the animals, but also the sanctuary is in question. It's being attacked. So I guess we would disagree on that, because and at least in the Adventist church, there are Hebrew scholars like Davidson and Gain who are scholars in that who would say, yeah, there is the connection there.
There are some. I agree. I totally agree.